I always thought factories were predictable places. Noise, routine, tired people counting the hours until they can go home. Nothing more than steel, oil, and numbers on spreadsheets. At least, that's what I believed before I worked at Graveson Manufacturing. If you look that name up today, you might only find a few old records, vague news about an industrial accident in a small town called Hollowford, somewhere inland that most people couldn't point to on a map. You'll read about an electrical failure, an explosion, about victims whose bodies were never found. They'll mention lawsuits, shared liability, a quiet settlement. No one will talk about what I saw. What happened inside that place doesn't fit into any technical report, and the few witnesses who were left either lost their minds or decided to pretend nothing happened. I tried. For many years, I tried to erase it from my head, but the factory didn't stay in Hollowford. It came with me. On nights when the world gets too quiet, I still hear the sound of presses, the metallic snap of steel giving way, and something underneath that sound, a frequency that doesn't belong anywhere on this planet. Today, I'm going to tell the full story. Not the official version, not the one that made it into the papers. I'm going to tell you how an ordinary factory with ordinary people became the stage for something that shouldn't exist here. And why, since that night, I can't feel at ease anywhere machines run for too long. If you've ever driven past an industrial district late at night, seen a single lit window in a huge dark building, and felt a chill for no clear reason, maybe you passed a little too close to something like what I lived through. And the most disturbing part? It didn't start with screams. It started with details so small anyone could have ignored them. But every one of us in there ended up hearing the same call. My name is Ethan Ward. When I started working at Graveson Manufacturing, I felt like my life was finally getting on track. I'd been hired as night shift supervisor. Decent salary, benefits, a stable position in a place that, in theory, would never shut down. Graveson was a metal components factory, specialized in parts for heavy machinery. It sat on the outskirts of Hollowford, a small town with a main street that looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. It was the kind of place where everyone in some way depended on the factory. Someone worked there, someone provided services to it, someone had a relative stuck in that job. The main building of Graveson was too big for the town. A rectangular, gray structure with grimy skylights on the roof and narrow windows so high off the floor that nobody inside could actually see the street. From the outside at night, it looked like a dark, silent block, but inside, nothing ever stopped. I remember the first time I walked into the production floor. It was close to midnight. The fire door shut behind me with a dull thud, and it felt like the world outside had stopped existing. The sound was constant. Hydraulic presses slamming down and up, rollers grinding, metal conveyor belts carrying glowing pieces from one side to the other. The smell was a mix of burnt oil, heated metal, and human sweat. Fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, stretching shadows across the concrete floor between steel columns and rows of machines lined up in corridors that seemed to go on forever. The people on the night shift had something different about them too. They weren't just workers, they were like characters trapped in a loop, repeating the same movements for years. There was Mark Holloway, the operations manager, tall, broad-shouldered, always holding a clipboard with permanent dark circles under his eyes, like he'd never truly slept. Evelyn Brooks, a veteran press operator with almost 20 years in the plant, whose eyes looked like they knew more than she'd ever say. Daniel Price, security, who spent half the night walking the corridors and the other half staring at the camera feeds like he was waiting for something different to appear. Liam Carter, maintenance tech, who knew every bolt in that place and loved to say, half joking, that the factory had moods of its own. And Claire Morgan, quality control, who wrote everything, absolutely everything, in a small black notebook she never let go. On my first day, they explained the basics. Night shift, smaller crew, bigger responsibility. Any problem in there was on us. One mistake, one delay, one unexpected shutdown in a critical machine, it all landed on the night shift. It seemed simple, but soon I started noticing things that weren't normal. The first one was the West Wing sector. On the evacuation map, there was an area marked at the far west of the building, labeled only as Technical Sector, Restricted Access. On the building plan, it was an entire block with corridors, storage rooms, and an old decommissioned foundry area. But walking through the factory, that area simply didn't exist. The walls seemed to stretch on without leaving room for any door leading into it. It was as if the building had been planned with that sector in mind, but then built differently. When I asked about it, I got generic answers. They said it was an old, condemned area shut down after a chemical accident years ago, that no one had authorization to enter, that the access points had been sealed. But even without seeing it, I could feel that something occupied that space. The second strange thing was the way everyone talked about the factory whistles. Officially, the whistles marked shift start and end, breaks, emergencies. But according to what they told me, sometimes in the middle of the night a whistle would blow on its own. No schedule, no reason. A longer, sharper sound, different from all the others. They called it the empty call. No one would admit they were afraid, of course. They laughed, made jokes, treated it like night shift superstition. But every single person's expression changed when the subject came up. On my third week, I experienced that so-called call. It was 3017 a.m. I remember the time because I had just finished logging a production record and, out of habit, glanced up at the digital clock on the main panel. Everything was running fine, within the usual chaos, machines working, exhausted workers still on their feet. Suddenly, the factory sound system emitted a whistle. It wasn't a siren alarm. It wasn't any kind of standard signal. It was a long, high-pitched tone that seemed to come from very, very far away, like the building structure itself was vibrating. A tone that didn't match any industrial sound I'd gotten used to, and the worst part, it didn't respect distance. I was on the east side of the plant, but the whistle sounded right next to me, inside my ear, like it was something internal, not external. The machine slowed for a fraction of a second, as if they'd heard. It too. Some lights flickered, and the floor trembled so quickly and subtly that I almost believed I'd imagined it. The workers froze. They didn't run. They didn't scream. They just stopped moving for a few moments, like they were part of the machinery. Then, everything went back to normal. Noise, routine, tired faces. But the factory no longer felt like just a factory. It felt like an organism testing its own breath. That day, Evelyn casually commented that the whistles had never started before a certain construction project. It was after they dug too deep, she said, and that was it. Dug too deep. At the time, I had no idea how long that phrase would echo in my head. A few months before I started, Graveson had gone through a major renovation. That was one of the first things Mark explained to me. They'd expanded the heavy machine area, reinforced the foundations, and prepared the building to receive newer, more powerful equipment to boost production capacity. The problem was that the expansion required deep excavation. In practice, that meant tearing up the concrete, digging far down into the ground, and, according to rumors, hitting a layer of rock the engineers hadn't expected to find there. Liam, the maintenance tech, was the kind of guy who couldn't keep that sort of story to himself. He told me that during the construction, some of the workers heard things coming from deep within the foundation, not just the echo of machinery or power tools vibrating. Longer sounds, patterned ones, like something down there was answering the beat of the drills. In the right context, that's the kind of thing you laugh off. But when you're alone in a narrow hallway at 3 in the morning, with flickering lights and an entire factory humming around you, those stories are a lot harder to ignore. One night, after another empty call, the camera system started showing some curious failures. Daniel, in the security room, called me to take a look. On several monitors, the image was distorted. Not like normal interference full of static or frozen frames. The distortion seemed organized. On some screens, white lines crossed each other at impossible angles, forming symbols that looked like geometric shapes, but nothing familiar. On others, the image of the machines repeated in layers, like a reflection inside another reflection, stretching the corridors until they seemed endless. It lasted only a few minutes. Then everything went back to normal, worn-out equipment, moving belts, workers trying not to fall asleep standing up, but that same scene repeated itself in almost everyone's dreams that night. No one talked about it directly, of course, but I could see it in their eyes, in sentences that died halfway. I had the same dream. In mine, I walked through the factory, but didn't recognize a single face. Everyone wore the same uniform, same PPE, but their bodies were just silhouettes, silhouetted by an overly white light from the ceiling. The machines were silent, except for a single press in the center of a large space I didn't recognize. Above it, where there should have been a skylight, there was only a circular opening, black, where nothing reflected. As I got closer to that opening, something inside it began to pulse. Not light, not sound. Presence, a kind of consciousness without form that seemed to measure how close I was. Each step made the floor feel softer, as if I were walking on living material, something breathing. Right before I got too close, I'd wake up, always sweating, with the feeling I'd been observed all night. When, during a break, I overheard Liam mentioning his own dreams with holes in the ceiling and idle machines, I realized it wasn't just me. It was around this time that people started talking about the West Wing, the forbidden sector, in a different way. Before, they spoke of it as a condemned space, a place of physical or chemical risk. Now, some workers, almost always in whispers, said that area should never have been built there. According to them, an old foreman called Harold Pierce, who had worked on the foundation of Gravesend, left notes in a notebook about strange things that started during construction. No one knew exactly where this notebook was. Some swore it had been destroyed along with the old archive. Others said it still existed, hidden somewhere in the factory. The idea of a forgotten record started eating away at me. I needed to know. On a particularly quiet night, after a strange sequence of quick power flickers, I decided to dig through the central control room, a small office set above the production floor, with windows overlooking most of the factory. Among old folders, boxes of yellowed documents, and equipment manuals, I found a thick, brown-covered volume with no title. When I opened it, I realized these weren't manuals. They were construction notes. At the top of the first page, a name, Harold Pierce. The following pages showed dates, measurements, comments about the soil, the structures, the behavior of drilling machines. In one section, a note kept reappearing on different days in slightly different words. The drill bits resonate against something that isn't rock. Then, no previous geological test indicated a cavity here. Later, operators report hearing a sound like air passing through a pipe, but the cavity hasn't been opened yet. And finally, today, when we shut the equipment down, the sound continued for a few seconds. Rhythmic sequence, almost deliberate. The next pages were more chaotic, the handwriting shaky, sometimes unreadable. One sentence, though, burned into my memory. Oh, the foundation is stable, but we have to face the fact. We built Gravesend's base on something that responds. And there is no technical term for that. There was no official explanation, no engineering opinion, no conclusion. Just those words, buried among tables and diagrams. As I read, I felt something I hadn't felt since childhood, a real urge to close the notebook and pretend I'd never found it. But it was too late. I'd already made the obvious connection no one wanted to face. The excavation had hit something down there. Something that wasn't rock or gas or anything you'd find in a standard engineering report, and, in a way, that something had never stopped responding. After finding the notebook, I started paying closer attention to things I'd previously written off as random glitches. The timing of the power dips seemed to follow a pattern. They weren't overload-based shutdowns, but micro-interruptions happening at specific times, almost always between 30,000 and 3220 a.m. The anomalous whistles happened mostly on nights when production set a record, as if the factory was satisfied or exhausted. And some workers, especially those who worked close to the older machines, the ones rooted into the original foundation, started experiencing what people called blackouts. They weren't fainting spells. They stayed standing, eyes open, but their minds seemed far away. They'd go still for a few seconds, then snap out of it, with no clear memory of what they'd been doing the moment before. The official explanation was always the same: fatigue, exhaustion, long shifts, but I already knew there was more. It was on one of those nights of collective blackouts that, for the first time, someone heard more than just the whistle. According to Daniel, the sound of the empty call was followed by a barely audible noise picked up by one of the corridor cameras near the sealed West Wing access. On the recording, after the whistle, there was a low, distorted murmur, as if it were coming from very deep below. An irregular sequence of sounds, too strange to be human voice, but too deliberate to be mechanical noise. They tried playing the audio over and over, boosting the signal, cleaning it up. The cleaner it got, the less it sounded like noise, and more like an attempt at rhythm, a stubborn pattern, almost hypnotic. From then on, my idea of routine started to shift. I'd always thought of our daily repetition as human, schedules, reports, targets, shifts. But in that factory, there was another kind of routine running at the same time. Something older, more patient, deeply connected to the building's architecture. We weren't just producing parts, we were feeding a cadence. And down there, under the foundations, something had learned to count. What happened on the night of the accident, or rather, on the night they called an accident, didn't start with an explosion or a scream. It started with silence. It was a Tuesday, night shift, reduced crew, but with a ridiculous amount of production to push out. A major client had demanded an emergency batch, so as exhausted as everyone was, stopping wasn't an option. The machines were running at their limits, the heat on the production floor was suffocating, and something in the air felt like it was building up. You could almost touch it. Like static before a storm. At 2058 a.m., the factory lights flickered 3 times at perfectly equal intervals. It wasn't a power outage. The machines kept running, but everyone stopped for a second. Nobody said it out loud, but I saw Evelyn's eyes meet mine. She had seen this before. At 3012 a.m., the factory's sound system turned on by itself. No announcements, no music, no message. Just a low hum, like an open microphone pointed into a huge, empty space. The camera feeds began alternating between normal images and distorted ones, full of duplicate frames of the same corridors. The angles looked wrong, as if the lenses were capturing a space larger than the one that physically existed. That's when I noticed something I'd never paid attention to. Some of the older machines, the ones most connected to the original foundation, were vibrating out of sync. While the rest of the production hit a constant, predictable beat, those machines anticipated slightly, as if they were receiving early commands from another unseen source. At 3007 a.m., the whistle sounded, but this time it wasn't a single empty call. It was several whistles in sequence, moving up and down in tone like something or someone was trying to form a kind of melody, a clumsy melody, still learning but with intention. Everyone stopped. Not because someone ordered them to, but because their bodies reacted. The press motors went wild. Some started slamming non-stop, others froze mid-stroke. Belts kept moving even without parts being fed. The floor shook beneath our feet, but not in a natural way. The vibration wasn't spreading normally. It was rising from specific points, tracing an invisible network under the concrete. One by one, the workers slipped into that semi-blackout state. They stood still, staring at some random point, until we realized it wasn't random at all. They were all looking in the same direction, straight down the machine aisles, toward the west side of the building, toward the West Wing. That's when the impossible happened. A door that officially didn't exist opened. Between 2 metal columns that had always seemed part of the wall, a gap appeared. It didn't move like a normal door, with hinges creaking or locks snapping. It was more like the materials had been subtly rearranged over the years, and that night the alignment finally clicked. Behind the opening, there was a narrow, dark corridor, no technical access labels, no caution signs, nothing. The lights around us flickered again, and for an instant, all the noise seemed to drop a few levels, like the factory was holding its breath. Then the people started walking. Nobody argued. Nobody questioned it. Without a word, the night shift crew, Evelyn, Liam, Claire, the others, began walking toward that door, as if pulled by a gravitational center that had just been switched on. I tried to speak, tried to shout their names, grab someone, stop them. But the words in my throat came out weak. It was like trying to talk inside a heavy dream. I was the only one who resisted for a few seconds, maybe because I'd read Harold's notebook, maybe because fear itself had formed some kind of barrier. Daniel, the security guard, came running from the side, eyes even wider than usual. He also looked only half caught in the trance. We looked at each other. We didn't need to speak. We both knew that if we let everyone go all the way down that corridor, they weren't coming back. But we also knew we couldn't just run away and leave it to happen. For some reason, I still don't fully understand, the dominant feeling wasn't just fear. It was the realization that something that night had shifted from observation to interaction. The factory wasn't just responding anymore, it was calling, summoning. With no time to think, we followed the group at a distance. We stayed a few meters back, forcing ourselves to remain conscious, repeating in our heads our names, the name of the town, dates, any concrete information that tethered us to reality. Crossing into that corridor felt like stepping across a thermal border. The air grew heavier, denser, with a metallic scent that wasn't like the production floor, colder somehow, like iron that had never been heated but had been, dormant for a long time. The walls were bare concrete, but as we moved forward, thin cracks started to appear, forming patterns reminiscent of the distortions we'd seen on the camera screens. They weren't natural cracks. The lines crossed at angles too precise to be random. At some point, the floor began to slope downward, almost imperceptibly. Our steps got a little quicker, not because we wanted to, but because the incline itself pushed us towards something deeper. Eventually, we reached a wide underground chamber. There were no conventional machines there, not in any way we recognized. At the center stood a circular structure made of metallic columns linked by cables running up the walls and disappearing into the ceiling. It was impossible to tell whether this had been built by human engineers or was some spontaneous arrangement of materials. Around this central structure, the floor was marked with concentric circles of metal embedded into the concrete, all connected. They looked like rails that led nowhere. The workers began positioning themselves, almost mechanically, at certain points along those circles. Each person took a place as if following a choreography they'd known all their lives. When the last one stopped, the central structure began to vibrate. It wasn't the sound of a motor or a generator, it was deeper, more like a physical translation of a thought. The vibration swelled, and in the empty space between the metal columns, the air started to distort, like heat over a flame. Except there was no flame. And instead of a warm shimmer, something entirely different appeared. It wasn't light, it wasn't shadow, it was a compact darkness that ignored the rules of the room. A black mass that didn't just block sight, it seemed to absorb any attempt to focus on it. The more I tried to look, the less I understood its edges or size, and yet I knew it was looking at me. The feeling was like standing in front of something that had long existed only in fragments, in floor vibrations, in stray whistles, in flickering lights. Something that night had finally synchronized enough to manifest more directly. It wasn't a monster in the usual sense. No claws, no teeth, no clear face. But there was a center, a core of awareness, and around it tiny bursts of light blinking in and out like miniature traffic lights, alarms, machine indicators. Red glows, amber tones, harsh white flashes, each flickering on its own timing. I suddenly thought of the factory layout, of the monitors. It was as if all those tiny lights bulbs, digital panels, on-off indicators across the years had been watched and studied by that presence until it learned to mimic them. As if that thing under Graveson had spent decades learning the language of industry and now spoke it fluently. The machines on the surface began to respond. Even down there, we could feel the echo of hammering impacts, belts speeding up, rails groaning. There was no one operating them upstairs, but production not only continued, it increased. With the fear that felt too big to fit in my body, I realized that whatever this entity was, it wasn't just manifesting, it was taking control of the industrial process. The workers around the structure were no longer in simple blackouts. They seemed conscious, but not for themselves. Everyone's breathing synced with the vibration from the core. Chests rising and falling in the same rhythm as the pulsing lights. It was a kind of involuntary synchronization, a possession through a technological ritual that was never meant to exist. Meanwhile, something began happening to the space. The walls, once solid and clear, seemed to drift further away. The chamber looked like it was stretching, as if the central point were pulling dimensions toward itself. It wasn't ordinary physical expansion. It was like space was a rubber sheet being slowly pulled around that presence. Daniel and I stood at the very edge of the outermost circle, half under that influence but still with some control. It felt like standing at the edge of a slowly opening abyss. We knew that a few steps closer and we'd be swallowed. That's when the true nature of that thing became clear. It wasn't just some cosmically weird being. It was something that existed through patterns. The excavation had been the first physical contact. The factory's foundation gave it a solid structure. But years of production presses slamming at the same intervals, whistles marking the same times, machines switching on and off in predictable sequences, had given that thing something it never had before, a repetitive ritual, a mechanical liturgy. We were the unwilling priests of a nameless cult built on shift schedules and productivity goals. The entity, fed by that repetition, shaped itself according to what it found. Warning lights, siren sounds, engine vibrations. And now, with enough energy accumulated, it was trying to extend its reach. Not just control the factory, use the factory as an antenna, a lever, a doorway for something bigger. That's when I realized, if this kept going, it wouldn't stay confined to Graveson. The electromagnetic field generated by that combination of machines, cables, and structure could spread, infect other networks, other systems. The world is full of places where repetition rules, other factories, production lines, computer networks, entire cities with synchronized traffic lights and clocks. Graveson wasn't the final goal. It was just the first lab. With a kind of desperate clarity, I understood that if no one did anything, that night wouldn't end with a localized accident. It would end with a point of contagion for something that didn't understand limits the way we do. I wasn't an electrical engineer or a theoretical physicist, but I was a supervisor. I understood enough about the factory's logic to know where it was most vulnerable. The entity fed on synchrony, but it depended on it too. If I could break, distort, collapse that pattern, maybe I could interrupt the connection, even just long enough to stop the expansion. The problem was that would mean creating such chaos inside the factory that nothing would be left standing. With no time to think about consequences, I ran back up the ramp, dragging Daniel with me. Every step felt like pushing against an invisible current, like walking in deep surf. The urge to stop, to turn around and join the others around the central structure was almost irresistible. But I kept going. Back on the production floor, the factory no longer looked like a factory. The machines operated at different speeds, stretched beyond known physical limits. Some presses slammed up and down faster than they should be physically capable of. Others moved slowly, like submerged in water. Chains, cables, rails, everything traced complex patterns in space. The floor looked more like a three-dimensional diagram in motion than a workplace. I headed for the central control room. Inside, the monitors no longer showed images of the factory as it really was, but warped variants of the underground chamber, the vibrating core, and other places I didn't recognize. Places that maybe weren't even part of Graveson. Even without fully understanding what I was seeing, I sensed one thing. The entity was using the factory to map itself into other places. Taste other spices. The only thing I could do was fight back using the only weapon I had, the infrastructure itself. The control panels still responded. For some reason, the main system hadn't been fully taken over. Maybe the entity was more focused on the physical ritual than the digital layer. I began piecing together an improvised plan. If I triggered a total shutdown and killed everything at once, it might not be enough. The entity had already tasted what it was like to exist through power lines and circuits. A full blackout might even make it easier for it to shift into some other form, but there was something electrical systems, hate, chaotic signals. Instead of shutting things down, I started issuing commands that no sane operator would dare send, reprogramming machines to receive conflicting instructions, forcing diagnostic cycles at maximum load, switching lines on and off at random without any pattern. I knew this could destroy the entire industrial park, but that was exactly the point. Within minutes, the production floor turned into a scene of mechanical collapse. Sparks burst from overloaded panels, motors spun and jammed at unpredictable intervals, belts spun in opposite directions. Presses slammed and froze halfway through their movement, as if the metal itself had given up. From the underground chamber came a single sharp tone that wasn't the factory whistle anymore. It was the entity's response. It wasn't a scream, it was a kind of dissonance, an audible discomfort. The synchrony, so carefully built over years, was being ripped apart. Something began to unravel in space itself. Reality around the factory felt like it was twisting. It was like being in a plummeting elevator, your stomach pulled upward, but without any real physical movement. I could still see the chamber and the vibrating core through the camera feeds. The lights around the entity started blinking erratically, as if it were trying to adapt to the imposed chaos. But the rhythm never locked. It couldn't find a new pattern. The workers down there began to collapse to the floor, one by one, as if their strings had been cut. They didn't look dead. Their chests moved, limbs twitched slightly, but they were disconnected. The central structure of metal columns began to warp, not like something giving way under weight, but like it was being pulled in different directions at once. I kept making it worse on purpose. More random commands, more overlapping diagnostic cycles, more induced faults. Then, suddenly, everything turned white. Not a usual kind of flash, no fireball, no blast wave. It was a total loss of contrast, of outline. For a few seconds, which might have been minutes or hours, I don't know, there was no difference between walls, machines, people, floor. Just the impression that I'd been yanked out of place. When my vision began to clear, I was outside the building. It was still dark, still night, but the sky seemed slightly brighter, like a storm was coming. Graveson stood in front of me, silent, with some broken windows and smoke drifting from scattered points. The external alarms were sounding, but weakly, like they'd gone off late. Beside me, Daniel was on his knees, struggling to breathe. A few other workers were scattered across the parking lot, dazed, with no idea how they'd gotten there. Emergency crews, fire trucks, ambulances, all of that came later. The official explanation boiled down to chain failure, a general short circuit, structural risks that forced the site to be condemned. No report mentioned the underground chamber. No record used the word entity, but even from outside, looking at the factory for the last time, I knew nothing had truly been fixed. I'd interrupted the synchrony. I'd ruined the perfect liturgy it used to manifest. But once something like that learns a language, it doesn't forget it. It retreats, watches, waits for another chance. What remained after Graveson? Graveson Manufacturing was demolished a few months later, officially due to structural instability and contamination in the underground areas. There were lawsuits, investigations, some headlines. Then it faded from the news. People in town moved on as best they could. Some found jobs in other plants, other fields. Families of the victims, those who were just gone, no bodies, no funerals, had to make do with settlements and a grief that never got a proper name. I was considered one of the key witnesses, but not a very reliable one. Doctors blamed my anxiety attacks on survivors' guilt, on the trauma of seeing injured co-workers, the emergency vehicles, the chaos of an industrial collapse. I never officially told anyone about the chamber, the vibrating core, the feeling of standing in front of something that had used our routine as a tool, but in my head, it never left. For a while, I tried to avoid any place with heavy machinery. I worked in offices, stayed away from industrial zones, took longer routes just to avoid certain neighborhoods. But the world isn't built for that. Everything now is pattern, repetition, cycles, traffic lights, transportation, interconnected systems, lines of code running on servers no one sees. And one night, years later, I realized something that froze me more than any Graveson whistle. I was home, in a regular apartment building, in a city far from Hollowford, trying to sleep without medication for the first time in a while. The place was quiet. Suddenly, I heard a sound from the hallway outside my door. It wasn't music, and it wasn't footsteps. It was a low, repeating noise, a water pump kicking in, a ventilation motor turning on at fixed intervals, something like that. For a few minutes, it was just a neutral background. But at some point, I noticed the sequence wasn't perfectly stable. There were tiny changes, slight shifts in timing, like it was testing combinations. The worst part wasn't the sound. The worst part was realizing that, in time with it, I'd started breathing in the same rhythm, exactly like all of us had in that underground chamber. I immediately stepped away from the hallway, shut off everything I could, closed my eyes, and did something I'd learned to do since Graveson. I wrecked any sense of perfect synchrony inside my own head. I stomped my foot on the floor in random beats, counted numbers out of order, sang mismatched lines of different songs in my mind. It sounds ridiculous, but it worked. The feeling passed. And that's when I understood, more clearly than ever, what really remained after those foundations crumbled. Graveson was a first attempt, an accidental lab. The entity, or whatever exists behind those whistles and vibrations, learned something essential about us. We love repetition. We build our lives around routine. We turn things on and off at the same times every day. We accept living inside patterns, even when they crush us. All that is fertile ground. The factory fell, but the language remained. Every repetitive system we create is, potentially, another door. That's why I'm telling this story, not just to scare you with the idea of a monster under an old factory, but to remind you that not every pattern is innocent, that there's a point, right there, where routine becomes worship. Maybe while you were listening to this, you noticed some background sound where you are. A distant engine, a ticking clock, a fan, the ping of notifications coming in regular bursts. Maybe, without realizing, you started syncing your breathing to one of those rhythms. If you notice that, break it. Now. Change your pace. Tap your hand on the table offbeat. Stand up. Take 3 steps in the wrong direction. Mess up your own pattern. Is it a silly precaution? Maybe. But if you had seen what I saw on that night in Hollowford, you'd know it costs nothing. And before you go, remember this. Stories like this only stay stories as long as they're trapped here, in memories, in accounts, in videos. When you share them, comment on them, spread them, you're giving them a little more reach. And in this case, maybe that's exactly what we need. If you want more people to know that some patterns should never be followed to the end, spread this story. Tell someone. Leave a record that once a factory woke up, and the thing that awakened inside it didn't vanish with the rubble. It just learned how to wait. And the next time you drive past an industrial building at night, see just one light on, hear a distant whistle that doesn't match the time, don't stop to listen. Don't try to get used to the sound. Don't let your body fall into its rhythm, because maybe on the other side something is counting, waiting for your answer.